life cycle carbon assessment guidance and Be Seen energy monitoring guidance. So we're going to have a break between the two sessions just before 11 AM. You're very welcome to stay for both sessions or just tune into the section that you're most interested in. The first session will be from Anne-Marie and Chan, covering whole life cycle carbon assessments, and we're going to follow that with a Q&A session. We're then going to have a short break and resume at 11 AM with Ioanna, Robert and Dominic, who will be covering our Be Seen energy monitoring guidance, again followed by a Q&A session. And so we're hoping to have that all wrapped up by 12 o'clock. Just a bit of housekeeping. We're recording the webinar and we'll be providing links to the YouTube playlist at the end of the presentation. All attendees are muted, so your video and audio is not visible, and the chat and the Q&A won't be published. We're going to be playing some pre-recorded presentations today, and that's to assist with accessibility and so that we can provide captions for the speakers. But I do want to stress that all the speakers today are very much here and they're listening out for your questions. So please do use the Q&A function to ask questions. You're very welcome to do that as the presentations are happening. If you've got any technical problems, can you please use the chat function to let us know? And feel free to like each other's questions in the Q&A. That'll help us know if there's any common themes or recurring issues. We might not be able to answer every question. I think we've got a lot of people here today, but we will of course try to cover as many as possible. Just to briefly set a bit of context for the guidance and for the sessions today. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the London Plan, but for anyone who's not, the London Plan sets out the overall strategic plan for London. It brings together the geographical aspects of the Mayor's other strategies and policies. So the new draft London Plan prepared by Mayor Sadiq Khan will, when it's finalised, replace the London Plan of 2016. It's been subject to an examination in public and there's an accompanying evidence-based library online. It's currently at a very advanced stage. It was submitted to the Secretary of State in December 2019, and the Secretary of State responded issuing directions to specific policies in March 2020. So the Mayor's now currently in discussions with the Secretary of State to address those directions and to finalise the plan. The guidance we're discussing today is part of a wider suite of London Plan guidance that's being developed to provide further detail to support and implement the London Plan policies. There's a number of other pieces of guidance that are out to consultation at the same time, so those are all available on our website. The guidance doesn't go through the same examination process as the plan, but it is subject to consultation, which is going to be taken into account before the guidance is finalised. So it's also a material consideration when deciding planning applications. You might be familiar with the guidance. We published it for information in April 2020, and we weren't expecting to be able to undertake consultation during that period before the May 2020 election. But obviously due to COVID-19, the mayoral elections were postponed to May 2021. So we're now going out to formal consultation on these pieces of guidance and the rest of them that are on our website. So I think that's it from me in terms of an intro. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Anne-Marie to kick off the first session on whole life cycle carbon assessments.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Just sharing my screen now. Hello everyone, I'm Anne-Marie Robinson. I'm Principal Policy Officer in the GLA's climate team. In today's webinar, I will be talking through London's climate aims, the background to the whole life cycle carbon emissions policy. I'll also provide an outline of the guidance and how to submit a whole life cycle carbon assessment before handing over to Chen Li from Kundal, who will talk through the assessment template and how we expect applicants to comply with the policy. Kundal, along with Targeting Zero, were appointed by the GLA to provide technical advice and support in the development of the whole life cycle carbon guidance document, and also helped draw together views and feedback from industry through our stakeholder engagement activity with developers, architects, engineers and consultants, among others. We'll spend around 25 minutes presenting before we open up to questions. The Mayor has an ambitious climate agenda and wants London to be a net zero carbon city by 2030, with clean transport, efficient buildings and a clean energy supply. We've published a 1.5 degrees C climate action plan to support this, which is compatible with the Paris Agreement. We are also aiming to be a zero waste city, have the best air quality of any major city, and increase green cover by 50%. Our approach to achieving these aims is set out in London's first integrated environment strategy, and there are also a number of programmes supporting these aims and published action plans, including those on fuel poverty and on solar. The London Plan is an important tool in the work we are undertaking to respond to the climate emergency, and the whole life cycle carbon policy and guidance represents a step change in how we ensure the planning system plays its role in meeting our net zero carbon target alongside the new Be Seen energy monitoring policy. This is a reminder of the whole life cycle carbon policy wording set out in policy SI2DB, which requires all referable developments carbon emissions through a nationally recognised assessment and demonstrate actions to reduce whole life cycle carbon emissions. For the first time, we are requiring planning applications which are referred to the Mayor to calculate and reduce embodied carbon. This is in addition to calculating and reducing operational carbon emissions as part of the whole life cycle carbon approach. We weren't attempting to reinvent an assessment process with our guidance. There are British standards and the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors guidance, both of which our approach stems from and which applicants are expected to comply with, although there are a couple of instances where we've diverged slightly from the RICS guidance and which we'll touch on later. What the GLA guidance does is to set out how to comply with the London Plan policy, what information applicants need to provide, and how and when we'll assess them. The document also links to the new circular economy statement guidance, for which there are separate webinars being held later this month and in December, which you can find on our website. There are synergies between these two policy areas, which we've outlined in the guidance, and that's really to prevent any duplication of effort on the applicant's part. The building and construction sector globally is responsible for 39% of carbon emissions, with 28% coming from the energy needed to heat, cool and power them, and 11% from materials and construction. With the building stock expected to double globally by 2050, there's a real need to fully capture the carbon footprint of what we're building, from the emissions associated with extracting materials through to what happens at the end of a building's lifetime. Operational carbon emissions will make up a declining proportion of a development's whole life cycle carbon emissions as operational carbon targets become more stringent. The diagram here shows how significant the embodied carbon of a building can be, with the green segments representing embodied carbon emissions compared to the light grey segment, which represents the operational emissions. There's a wide range of activity going on to establish standardised methods and approaches to assessing whole life cycle carbon, and this form of carbon assessment is increasing in prominence in discussions around how we get to net zero, from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors guidance to various developers who are undertaking embodied carbon assessments as part of their core business, to the international networks that we're a part of, including the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, who are developing tools to help cities identify these emissions that aren't typically captured. And we also have the Committee on Climate Change, who've been calling on government to establish a framework to assess whole life cycle carbon emissions. Our policy in London really contributes to this growing prominence of this form of assessment to really ensure that London is accounting for the embodied carbon of its buildings as well as the operational carbon as part of a whole life cycle carbon approach. And there are a number of outcomes we're trying to achieve, including getting developers to think more consistently and comprehensively about this form of assessment, so it really does inform building design, also encouraging the reuse of existing materials, the retrofit retention of existing structures and fabric, as well as encouraging more durable construction and flexible design for greater building longevity. Our definition of whole life cycle carbon emissions is represented in this diagram. It covers the extraction of raw materials, the manufacture and transportation of materials to site, on-site construction, as well as operational emissions. And for the operational emissions segment, the energy assessment guidance still applies here in terms of how to calculate operational emissions. And again, to avoid duplication of effort, the operational emission figures calculated as part of an applicant's energy strategy are lifted and essentially dropped into the whole life cycle carbon assessment, which is explained further in the guidance and also links to the requirements under the BC energy monitoring policy. Then we have the emissions from maintenance of the building, repair and replacement, and finally dismantling, demolition and eventual material disposal, and it's this element which primarily links to the circular economy statement. The Mayor's net zero carbon target continues to be based on operational regulated emissions, and so it's not a whole life cycle carbon target. Through research, discussions and evidence from stakeholders that came through the London Plan consultation, it emerged that we don't have a solid enough basis to set a meaningful whole life cycle carbon target yet. There isn't enough consistent and comprehensive enough data and approaches to do that, but the inclusion of the whole life cycle carbon policy in the London Plan and the guidance that we've developed really sets us in that direction so we can get a better understanding of what good practice looks like. So while there aren't policy targets on whole life cycle carbon, part of Cundall's work for us was to consider whether we could set benchmarks that could be used to compare whole life cycle carbon assessments with when they're submitted to us. Appendix 2 is how the benchmarks are together, with an example given here for offices. And these benchmarks are based on assessments of projects carried out by Cundall in Targeting Zero and cross-referenced with data provided by eTool and OneClick, among others. We provided benchmarks for, as well as offices, retail, apartments, hotels, and educational uses. There are two sets of benchmarks, the first based on those project assessments, and the second are a set of aspirational benchmarks, which take the first set of benchmarks and apply the World Green Building Council's target of a 40% reduction in whole life cycle carbon emissions by 2030. Applicants will be required to compare their whole life cycle carbon assessments against these benchmarks, provide explanation if and when they differ, and we'll be doing scrutiny against those. This is a brief outline of the guidance and what it includes. It introduces the policy, its aims and benefits, as well as the links to the net zero target. The chapter on process and methodology explains when to submit a whole life cycle assessment. It sets out the life cycle modules, as well as acceptable sources of carbon data. It also covers the content of a whole life cycle assessment, what information should be included at each stage and how we'll scrutinise them. And finally, the appendices. The Appendix 1 outlines the software tools that may be used, although this is not exhaustive. Appendix 2 provides the benchmarks, and Appendix 3 gives a list of further guidance materials that will be helpful for applicants. There are a few key points to note in how to submit a whole life cycle carbon assessment. Planning applicants will be required to submit the GLA's whole life cycle carbon assessment template at pre-app stage, at stage 1 submission, and at post-construction. The template should be submitted in Excel, not as a PDF, and the post-construction assessment will be conditioned by local boroughs. As I've mentioned, the statement in policy SI7 will feed into the whole life cycle assessment, and there are links to the energy assessment guidance and the BC energy monitoring guidance. I'll now hand over to Chen to talk through the assessment template and the information required at each stage.
Thanks, Emery. Thank you for the introduction. And hi, my name is Chen Li, from a principal engineer from Cundall. We're part of the team who produced this guidance, especially also set up the policy and the benchmarks. And as part of the process, and Emery explained, we have developed a whole life carbon template, which the applicant could use at various application stages. Basically, the pre-application, outline and detail stages, and also the post-construction stage. At pre-application stage, we have developed about 20-ish questions, and mostly yes and no questions. People can define and answer. This is basically covers the early design decisions that could be beneficial for the project. And also we ask them to provide guidance answers and explanations of the source behind this, provide some additional information. And when you submit or move on to the outline planning stage, we have we'll be asking for more detailed information such as site opportunity and site constraints, and so people could provide the detail of the assessment itself. And also we ask people to provide information on actions already taken that have been reduced embodied carbon at this stage, and also any further opportunities you are expected to explore and you're expected to employ during the first design development stage that could reduce the embodied carbon or whole life cycle carbon of your project. We have produced in each application stage, apart from pre-app, we have developed a Excel template that breaks down embodied carbon of each building component. It's either kilogram of CO2 the total and or kg CO2 per square meter. And the purpose of this template is for people to provide detailed breakdown of the assessment result. This is for the energy officers who assess the result easier to identify the accuracy and the completeness of the assessment. And also when we compare this against other benchmarks and other schemes, people can make a more informed comparison because this provides a better breakdown of the data. And also in the outline planning stage, when there's less information available of your product, you could refer to the RSS guidance professional statement on material default selections in the material choices and transportation choices and also lifespan choices. In detailed planning stage, again, we require similar level information, but for materials and lifespan and specification, we would expect you to have more of that available at this stage. So we expect you to use more precise project material and lifespan information to generate the result. And also, but again, for anything that still you don't have at this stage, you can refer to the RSS document as a guidance. The information you provided at outline planning stage and detail planning stage will be used as baseline. And again, those will be the ones compared against the whole life carbon benchmarks we developed in this guidance. And also, we expect you to explain and provide explanation if there are discrepancies between your result and the benchmarks. It might be the site is difficult, or maybe there's constraint on the site. It limits you from using some of the reduction options. But also, we would like to see your commitment on how to further reduce this whole life carbon further. And one of the key requirement of this as part of the planning condition would be you are required to produce a post-completion whole life carbon update. And this needs to be submitted within 3 months of practical completion. And you need to update the calculation submitted before using the actual material specification used for the project, and also the actual emissions from site work, transportation, and any waste generated during construction. This way, we can actually, this is going to be quite valuable, not for for GLA, and also for the industry to get knowledge of how actual data is in terms of building whole life carbon, or in this case, upfront embodied carbon is calculated, and how this can be delivered, and what are there any gaps of prediction and actual submission. And also, when you submit this data, if that difference drastically from what you have previously submitted, you are required to provide explanation and also lessons learned, what have gone wrong or what have gone well in terms of during construction, and what could have been done in the next project of similar type. And as I said, you compare this against the benchmarks and you submit it in the previous stage. Okay, it's not, I don't think you'll be held against what you submitted before, but I think that's the purpose of this, to ask people to be more aware of the information they provide, and also you get better and better going forward how this data can be used and how you run assessment at the beginning and how you implement appropriate reduction options at different stage to make sure they are delivering the best benefit. And also in here, we mentioned assessment 1. We also asked them to also the applicant to do assessment 2, which takes consideration of great decarbonization published by the government. This not only applies to operational emission, also we expect you to apply this to material emission as well. Again, we will explain how we have explained how we want this to be implemented in the guidance, and we might also explain it a bit further when we have a Q&A later on. So the application will be passed on to energy officers to review at various stages. And what we hope to review data against, what we'll be reviewing data against is you review data against the completeness and technical quality and the reductions you achieved, and also the ambitions set out. Of course, at pre-application stage, we could only check initial commitment and how detailed the commitment could be, and how ambitious we think those targets or reductions commitment you set out. And in the outline and detail application, we will review data more rigorously, and also we will be looking at the material quantity submitted, and also how is that representative of a project this type, or are there any mistakes or omissions in this submitted. This way we'll get a more precise picture of the design, and also this way we can make sure people are accounting the full scope of the emission of the buildings. And at post-completion, you will provide, we'll ask you to, as I said, you'll be asked to provide as-built material quantities and specification. And you will check what reductions actually achieved. The reduction ambition you set out at the early stage, are they actually delivered? If not, what's the reason? And if it's yes, is there something we can use, we can build up on for future projects? For example, this is one of the example we received during this consultation process about this is early stage of outline planning application submission. What we did, we looked at what in terms of the questions they answered, and then we can comment on some of them is actually are they actually business case or just business sense of doing things the right way, or actually they challenge themselves doing something more ambitious. For example, they declare they're going to use 55 GGBS, which is good. We like the precise targets. And also if say they only can reuse sub-base from the demolition waste, this is not something that innovative, and also it's not something we qualifies for reuse of structures. Again, things like this will pick up and will comment, and that's will hopefully we'll have a dialogue with the design and the applicant to drive this bit further. During the outline or detailed planning stage, okay, we'll be reviewing the data a bit more rigorously, and also you will be asked to provide more information to us. For example, in this case, the assessment not only follow the RSS minimum requirement, but again, as Emery said, the GLA requirement is actually more rigorous than the minimum requirement for the RSCS. We actually ask them to provide more information than minimum. And also, for example, when we look at the data submitted to us, we realize the facade they only shows a float glass single pane, which clearly is not representing for the building of this type, not curtain walling type. And also, they have not provided material quantities, which is crucial for the energy officers who will be assessing the completeness of the assessment to make sure that actual data makes sense. And also quite interesting, when they summarize the data, the waterproofing membrane is actually in body cover is more than all the steel decking and reinforcement. But that doesn't normally make sense. I'm not saying it could be a mistake of the data. That's something the operator will pick up or challenge back for them to check the model to make sure that they actually represent reality. So in summary, we'll require a template in Excel form, which is really important. Otherwise, people could not search, could not check and compare against each other. And also, we'll need the material quantity to be provided to allow energy officers to check whether the whole of carbon figures seem appropriate. and the quantity of material estimated to be reused, recycled. Again, this links directly with the circular economy policy. You are required to submit that for circular economy assessment, and we just need the same document, same data to be provided here as well. And also, we'd like to see clear ambitions of reducing whole life carbon. This is not only a accounting exercise. We would like to see more ambitious targets and reductions being tried from those applications. So, as part of the consultation process, we have been receiving a few questions so far, and also in the Q&A, I think we'll address some of them. Again, all the questions we'll have opportunity to address more formally during the consultation process. But again, just to pick up a few key things, embodied carbon of MEP component, how people calculate it. They made reference, say, in the guidance, say, at the time of producing the guidance, there wasn't a key guidance published. Recently, our CIPC have published a guidance on how to calculate MEP component whole life carbon. Again, we'll be referring to that in our update, and also how to calculate decarbonisation of not only the energy and also the materials. Again, that's something people have been interested in, or who will probably provide more insight to that. And also, there's a few other areas we'll hope to address. Again, we'll cover this more in the Q&A session. Okay, now I'll hand over back to Anne-Marie for the closing statement.
Thanks, Chen, and thanks everyone for listening today. On this final slide, we've shared a link to the consultation survey, which should be submitted by the 15th of January, and a dedicated email, which you can use to ask us questions about the guidance, as well as a more general inbox and phone number to use for more general questions concerning the consultation process. You can also follow us on Twitter, sign up to the GLA planning newsletter, and there's also a link to the other guidance documents that are being consulted on at the moment, as well as a link to this presentation, which will be available following the webinar. Thanks again for listening.
Right, thanks everybody for that. That's a great presentation. We're now going to go into a Q&A session. We've had quite a few questions coming through, so I'm just going to start by looking at some of those. I think one of the first ones we've got about targets. So it's great to hear that the Mayor is targeting London to be net zero carbon by 2030. If that's truly the case, will we be introducing limit values for whole life carbon in the next few years? And will we be reducing those to zero or very low carbon by 2030? So I think maybe we'll start with that, and then there's maybe a related question about which kinds of development this policy applies to. Maybe Anne-Marie, do you want to kick off?
Sure, yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning of that because the presentation started playing again. Are we covering? Is this
sorry. It's a question around targets, basically. You know, if we've introduced this policy, are we going to set some targets around it?
Yeah, so this is something we have discussed quite comprehensively through setting up the policy and through the consultation process, and through all of that engagement. I think what we really found is that at this point we didn't have enough data, enough comprehensive information in order to do that at this point. So instead we took the decision to set up a series of benchmarks which are available in the guidance, and which that's something that people can respond to as well. And those can be used by applicants when they submit their data to compare how their performance looks against those benchmarks. And once we're going to receive a lot of data through this process, so we'll very much be using all that information and the assessments that come through to look at setting targets in the future. I think that's that's where we need to head. This is a new policy, particularly linking it to the planning process is a new endeavour. But over time, I think we're going to get more data in order to go further in the future and to set targets and to really figure out what good practice looks like and what best practice looks like. Yeah, figure out how we can sort of share that information as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think there was the related question to that, which is about, obviously this policy at the moment targets referable applications. At what stage does the Mayor intend to extend that to maybe smaller scale schemes?
Yeah, that's right. So at the moment, the policy is specific to referable development. So that's the more strategic ones. And the thinking behind that was, again, because this is a newer area of assessment, that's something we're rolling out. We really wanted to get that process right before rolling out further. Though having said that, local boroughs can choose to apply the guidance and the policy to smaller applications, to majors that are non-referable. So that boroughs can start doing that, and the guidance has been written in a way that would apply to that. But certainly appreciate that we do need to. The whole point of this policy is capturing and calculating more of the carbon than we do currently within the built environment. So again, over time, I think that's something that will extend, and we can't sort of give exact timescales for that yet. But as I say, over the next couple of years, as we sort of get to grips with this process and with the data that's coming through, I would certainly anticipate that that's all where we'll be heading to really extend the scope of the policy further.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anne-Marie. So we've got one of the most upvoted questions here is about data. So how will the data received be stored? Data will be invaluable, set future targets and caps, and should feed into existing databases, be held publicly and anonymously.
Sure. So all of that data will obviously be coming through directly to us for our whole life cycle officers to assess. Because it's linked to the planning process, that information then will of course be available through individual planning portals. That's obviously not going to be the easiest method for anyone to sort of get a good picture about what's happening across the board. What we do intend to do is similar to what we do already with assessing performance against the existing and the sort of older energy policies, is to produce an annual monitoring report on performance. Again, life cycle carbon policy as well. So if you're familiar with the annual energy monitoring reports that we publish each year, and the 2019 one just came out recently, so it'll be something similar for the whole life cycle carbon. And there's also some work going on. Some people on the call may have been at the workshop that RICS and Arup held a few weeks ago now, to look at the RICS embodied carbon database and to look at how it can be improved, sort of to make sure that people are using it. So we're involved in those discussions too, to figure out how we can, we really do see the importance of sharing data. We want to be able to share case studies, hopefully through the guidance as well. So that's something we're very conscious of and we'll look at doing. We obviously have, and this will be the second part of the webinar, but the Be Seen portal, it's specific to operational energy at the moment. But again, that's something that perhaps in the future we could look to extend further to add other functionality to. But yeah, that's something that we don't have a solution to yet, but that we're looking to provide information and data on, at least at a sort of an aggregate level at the start with case studies, and hopefully in the future look to share that information a bit more easily, case by case.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. There's a couple of questions here which I think are related about the amount we know about materials at various stages of the planning process. So and that's also related to a question on EPDs and the amount of materials out there that have that information available. So are we going to accept essentially that a lot of the information is going to be based on high level assumptions? Maybe Chan, you can come in on that one.
Sure, we do realize there's a limited amount of data being available at this, especially early stage. And we do hope with this push of getting everything more precise, more data should be available earlier and earlier. And also, if when you we do accept when you submit the data at the stages, there are things that are not available, or you cannot determine what they are, or the exact precise detail what they are. We ask you to refer to either RSS professional statement as a default, and then when you have the data, you replace that with the reality. And also, the point of this exercise is you then compare it against the as-built information when you have them. This will narrow the differences. So I think to answer those questions sort of quickly, yes, we accept a lot. I don't think we'll say huge amount. We accept there will be certain amount of data is not available. And also, again, as the annual officer will review the submission if we think a lot of data is not provided and we think they should be available at this stage. Of course, they will come back to you and ask for it. I think we cannot set out, say you have to provide 50% or 60% of them precisely. There's no limit, such a thing. We cannot decide on the percentage as yet, but we hope with more information we receive, people will be able to say, we know those information should be available at this stage. And also from a business perspective, that the client or design team would want to know more about the building at early stage as well. And also in terms of EPDs, if I just cover that bit things, and someone said about 20% EPDs, which I think it is true, but also we've seen a big flux, a big increase of number of EPD in the last couple of years. And seeing the people say like 1,000 EPDs was produced in the last couple of months, because again, because we start asking for them more and more, and the material suppliers will produce more EPDs. And of course, there will be items not available at the time of submission. And then what we ask you to do is refer to the RCS preference statement as the default values there, because E2 or one-click, they have default values, but some of them is probably not aligned, or how well they aligned with the RCS statement, I'm not so sure. So it's better to align with RCS rather than using default of your tool.
Thanks very much. There's a question here about alignment with the whole life carbon process for planning applications with BREEAM assessment. I don't know if that's almost been answered by the person below, but I don't, Chan, you're able to?
Sure, yeah, I think that when we set out the target and requirement, we made it I made sure is, if you do a whole life carbon assessment as part of the GLA, you will be covering the base, you're doing more than what needed for BREEAM purpose, because the category we asked you to cover is more precise. It's covering more elements compared to the BREEAM. And so you need to, and also the tool, if you look at the tools, the BRE approved in their portal, and also the tools we have sort of in the Appendix 1, we reviewed, they are aligned. And there are things that some of the software could be updated to sort of align with the GLA requirement more precisely, but in the GLA document, we're not limiting any other tools if you think you are meeting the requirement. But if your tool you think meets the GLA requirement but doesn't meet the BRE requirement, again, that's something we could not just approve for BRE. But in terms of the scope assessment and data required, they are perfectly aligned. But one point to note is we ask you to do a stage 2, almost that's the same stage as BRE, but for stage 4, you need to do a separate one for BREEAM purpose. And BREEAM doesn't ask you for a post-completion, which is slightly different to the GLA. It's for early stage is aligned, and especially you want to make sure you only do assessment once. You don't have to do it multiple times for the same thing.
Thanks very much. So another question is sort of relating to the process is there a process to prove the people who are actually carrying out these assessments are qualified to do that? Again, I don't know, Chan, I guess it all relates to the methodologies that we're using.
Mm-hmm. I think it's I mean, the BREEAM do say there's a competent personnel. How do you quantify that? But I think we haven't said you have to be trained in certain ways. I think our point is everybody could do this, and it just also that's why the review process is implemented. If you use a software or the approved softwares, that means you are following the certain standard, and also your data will be reviewed, and it'll be reviewed by qualified people. And I don't think there's any limit on who can or cannot carry out the assessment. But we do think, I mean, people will have certain experience they'll probably get onto this quicker. But if you have no experience, but if you follow the guidance for the RCS, it might be a slow start. But I don't think we are trying to discourage anyone from doing it. It's for us, this should be something everybody should be aware of in the design profession, at least to be more aware of. And we're not trying to make it quite bespoke for one or two professions.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Anne-Marie, maybe I'll direct this one to you. Given that whole life carbon assessments are relatively new and haven't been used widely and might not be used consistently, how enforceable will comparisons to the benchmark figures in the guidance be?
Sure. So as I said, they're benchmarks rather than targets, and we've made sure to sort of give a range there. We know there will be some variation, and data coming from different places. This is all in the context of a drive towards creating more consistency. So we've started receiving a number of assessments so far, and there'll be which are looking like they're coming within the range of the benchmarks that over time, as we see more assessments, there may be some divergences there. And what's really important is that applicants are able to explain where they do diverge, so that we can then use that information. So we're not going to be enforcing those benchmarks as such, more using this as a process to look at the assessments coming through, typically in London at a referable level, seeing how they compare with our benchmarks, and then looking at how they could be improved in future. And because they're set out in guidance, that's something that we have a bit more flexibility to keep them updated over time. I think once we've been through a year of this process, there'll be a lot of data. So I think that would possibly be a good point to look at, what those benchmarks are looking like. Whether we need to look at the ranges again, look at other data that's come out, but it's certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye on and making sure it's that we keep it open and flexible, and then we can keep making improvements.
Thanks very much. Another question, maybe a bit more of a technical one, about how the kilograms of CO2 per metre squared metrics are applied, and whether that's to gross or net floor area, and that there's a potential conflict between doing well on that metric and planning properly, effectively. I don't know if anyone's able to give a clear answer on that one.
Sure. I mean, the debate on using NIA or GIA, I think this can be either ways. I understand the reason someone asking for NIA because it shows efficiency. But what we're trying to do is using GIA is either one of those aligned with some of the cost consultant alignment, and also is lots of software are using the same way as GIA for benchmark reasons. And if you start using NIA, it's sometimes you're not reflecting the whole picture of the building. I know it's serving the purpose, but if you have a building is sitting on a challenging side, or have a particular reason for a inefficient layout or something, that's probably not reflecting the whole picture. And what we're trying to, what we could do is, if you think using the gross internal is not representing or not representing the reality of your building, you're more than welcome to provide a digital statement to say using NIA basis, because that's how efficient or not efficient this building could be. So but I think we have to use a standard unit to align all the benchmarks available. So at the moment we stick to GIA because that's where the most data is available in the market.
Great, thanks very much. Maybe a simple one, as an accredited tool, is one-click LCA acceptable?
Yes, in the appendix 1, there's a list of software. One-click is one of them. And also I think from my dialogue with them and a few other software providers, they are doing update to be more to align with the grid decarbonisation and also improve on certain areas. And also I saw the mentions about RSCS being sort of older document now. Yes, it's true. And also some part of that is being updated and will be updated accordingly in RSCS. And also will refer to in the guidance, we'll be referring to the most recent version of RSCS document.
Thanks very much. Maybe I'm going to direct this one towards Simon. Welcome, Simon. Having to undertake LCA via compliant software which outputs results and shows benchmark, it seems unnecessary to complete the Excel sheet for each material layer. It feels like there's duplication of work already done there. Is there a way to streamline the process or integrate with software that we're already using?
Thanks, Jan. I think the issue here is to enable comparison of submissions. So and also build up a reliable database of responses. It is very difficult for the GLA to examine a submission if it is not part of a standard template, and compare whether it is sensible or viable in relation to other ones. So that is why we've asked for it all to be done on the template.
I think if I may just add one point to this, because each software will have different output, it's difficult for people to compare results if you don't see the breakdown. The only reason we can ask them to have the same breakdown is to have a template people to follow. And again, as I said, there's a lot of software developers, they are making an automatic output to make it more easier to output data. So make sure the data is reviewed. That's in the example that I've shown in the presentation. That's how we pick up some potential mistakes or oversights of the data, because we can see the level breakdown. Otherwise, we cannot interrogate the level of details we would like to.
I think also the outputs are not at the moment the same from different software packages, but they will converge over time. And indeed, I think part of this process, part of the GLA process, to ensure convergence or assist convergence.
Thanks very much. Another question here, how is the carbon stored or sequestered in timber in buildings recognised and rewarded?
Sorry, it's probably another one for the template. The template asks you to put the carbon sequestration in a separate column. So you are able to list out, this is how much carbon is stored from a organic material we use in the building. And then again, you will end up having a lower benchmark or lower baseline of your building. So again, if you want to report them, we want them to report it separately, because you can see a benefit or a reduction from that element.
Thanks very much. Maybe one for Anne-Marie. Will the GLA share proposals for carbon reduction so other buildings, construction industry can benefit from this knowledge?
Sure, yeah, no, we definitely see that as very important. I think we'll use the monitoring report that I mentioned to flag case studies, good examples, trends and solutions that are coming forward, so that information is out there. And then again, this sort of feeds into sort of how we can look at sharing more information on solutions that are coming forward on a project by project basis, which the embodied carbon database that Rick said potentially looking at updated can fall into, or potentially, as I mentioned, our own monitoring portal. But yeah, no, we definitely appreciate there's a real need to share as much information and data as possible.
Thanks very much. Got a question. Oh, it's just appeared at the top. How many projects did Cundall assess to provide the whole life carbon benchmarks shown in the guidance?
In the appendices, we did list the amount of, there's a different number of projects in different categories. So there's a list. I think in offices we said it's average about 20 or 28 buildings were assessed so far, and then the data we refer to, one clearly referring to, I don't know, it's like hundreds of data, and E2 and other consultants provide data. So we did mention how many in each category, and we do acknowledge there's probably not that enough. We want hundreds and hundreds of data, but that's the state of the play now. Is if we don't have enough, we don't have that many, as many as we like, so to speak. And so, but that's what we have at the moment, and hopefully within the process, we'll get more data from this process, and then again the benchmark or database will be updated in the next version, hopefully.
We want to be as transparent around all that as possible. So as Chen said, if you look into the appendices, for each benchmark, you can see the breakdown of where the data's come from, how many buildings it relates to, and yeah, as Chen says, we need more data to build these up over time, which is what we'll be looking to do.
Thanks for that. So there's a bit of discussion going on this one, and it's maybe quite a nice link to our next session. Post-construction verification of assessments will be a crucial process to validate quality of results, and there's a little bit of discussion about that. So perhaps someone could comment on what our ideas around post-construction verification are.
Shall I have a go at that?
Sure.
I think the importance of post-construction is twofold. One is because it ensures that people are thinking about whole life carbon assessment throughout the whole process, rather than just it happening at planning and then being disregarded. The second reason is to, I think, ensure that that industry is able to improve the provision of things like EPDs and so on. So it's overall to do with improving the quality of reporting and improving the data available through these submissions. As far as there's a part of the question is to do with POE. I think the aspect obviously will take longer, but I think in terms of the operational aspect, it'll take longer. But in terms of projection and the ability to predict, that should be the same. But if Chenna, I don't think you want to add to that. Or
yeah, I think that's a crucial. Without the post-completion result, everything we've done at the beginning doesn't mean anything. So we don't know how the building is actually built. So I think that's the key thing. If anything, we get in this assessment is to make sure people actually deliver what they should supposed to do, and also we have a channel to check if something works well, something doesn't, how we improve on that. That I think for me and for the industry, I think is quite crucial on this process.
Thank you for that. Possibly got time for one or two more. This might be a quick one. Are the GLA expecting a report to explain the results and decisions, or is it just the spreadsheet?
So we've set it up so that you should just be able to use the Excel template. You know, we're conscious that there are various requirements across the energy policies to produce a strategy, with extra requirements in there that we've introduced in the new plan, and the whole life cycle carbon assessment as well. So we wanted to reduce the burden as much as possible. So all information can be submitted through that template without the need for an additional report. And it's that template that the whole life cycle officers will use, as well as all the data fields that Chen talked through and that we've covered. There are free text boxes for additional contextual information against the benchmarks, etc. So that in itself, it creates the report without the need for an additional sort of PDF on top of that Excel template.
Thank you. I think probably time for just one more, hopefully quite quick one, relating to SAP. So GLA guidance on whole life carbon mentions that current and future SAP carbon factors should be used, however does not specify which ones. One-click software has got a number of carbon factors to choose from, so just stating SAP is not sufficient or informative.
So we have said in the grid decarbonisation section of the guidance that first assessment should be based on SAP 10 emission factors, but making that very clearly linked to the GLA energy assessment guidance as well, where our approach to grid decarbonisation is covered. So it will be important to keep reference to that document as things change. You know, we're expecting a new Part L with hopefully new emission factors coming shortly, but this guidance does follow the current GLA approach to encourage SAP 10 emission factors at the moment. So yeah, that is specified in the guidance.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, I think I can see some more questions directed to Chen, to me, but I think if we don't have time, I think Condo will be running a separate workshop probably late in the month to expand on some questions we're not able to cover fully today.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, sorry that we haven't managed to get through absolutely all of those questions there, but hopefully we've got through a few that were quite helpful. We're going to take a break now for about 4 or 5 minutes before we resume with the next session, which is on VC and energy monitoring. So I'd just like to thank the speakers and the panelists for this first section, and I hope that you'll all rejoin us again in a few minutes. Thanks very much.